Assalamu alaikum, peace be with you, and welcome to Islam and Life with me, Tariq Ramadan, broadcasting from London. In today's show, we ask the question, why is France trying to remove Islam from the public sphere?
With the lack of mosques and prayer rooms suited for Islamic worship, thousands of French Muslims have recently taken to the streets of main cities to establish the communal Friday prayers. As a response, the French government issued a ban on street prayers, similar to those that have previously banned the veil from schools and the niqab from public places. These successive actions emphasize the French government's push to keep Islam out of the public sphere. With an estimated Muslim population of 4.1 million, French Muslims have access to only 1,500 prayer houses suited for worship. Most of these are housed in small, modest halls, often described as basement mosques. However, despite France's multi-ethnic landscape, Muslims face a severe difficulty in negotiating places for worship for lack of political representation. So what leads France to issue successive bans on visible elements of Islamic life, such as the headscarf, the face veil, and more recently, street prayers? This episode of Islam and Life asks, why is France trying to remove Islam from the public sphere?
If you travel around and you go to Muslim-majority countries and you ask about what is the situation for Muslims in France, the perception is quite negative. The perception is that in France, Muslims are facing discrimination, marginalization, because we heard about what happened in the 80s about the headscarf and then about the niqab and the face veil, and then also more recently about what is happening with the street prayers and talking about the mosques and the visibility of Islam is a problem in France. By the way, it's not only a problem for Muslims, anything which has to do with religions and the visibility of religion in France is problematic. Why is it so? What is the specificity of the French tradition here that we need to understand if we want to tackle the issue, and in which way the Muslims and the French Muslims could change the situation, improve the perception over there, and also be able to get their rights being implemented and understood as something which has to do with freedom of religion in and within laïcité, which is the secular French system, and what is the way forward. Well, to answer all these questions, I'm joined by the writer and blogger Myriam Francois Serra. Thank you so much for being with us. You are French by origin, you have multiple identities, so to speak, so you know the French situation. It's quite clear that when we start talking about France, the perception among Muslims is quite negative. It's as if in France it's very difficult to be a practicing Muslim for many reasons. When you wearing the headscarf, it's banned from schools, not from universities, but for girls between 14 and 17 years old. And then also we heard about the niqab and the so-called controversy around the burqa. And recently we heard the home ministers talking about street prayers, saying that it's unacceptable because it's against the French tradition and laïcité as it is understood there. Why? How would you explain to someone who is looking at the situation from abroad, why is it so? What is this French tradition which is called laïcité that it's sometimes very often, it's sometimes difficult to understand?
I'm not sure if I buy into the idea that the actual problem is laïcité, although obviously defining laïcité, or the very specific understanding of secularism which was elaborated in the French context, and specifically the idea that historically the Catholic Church had a very negative effect on the state and was creating a system which was unfair, that was biased towards a certain portion of the population, and therefore it was absolutely essential to differentiate the two and to ensure that in an ideal scenario, everyone had equal access to the state and equal access to practice their religion. These were the founding ideas behind the concept of laïcité. But I think more to the point, actually, the reason France struggles so much is not so much with the concept of laïcité as it is with its history, which is, you know, a former colonial power, and the idea that it was on a civilizing mission when it went out to Africa, to North Africa, to spread a very particular conception of itself, which was based on the idea that European and Western civilization had a civilizing mission to teach other people, and specifically sort of the barbarians in those sorts of lands. And I think it's that history which France is struggling with more.
But what would be the relationship between this and that? Because there is something which is quite important in what you are saying, is that in fact, the laicity and the French secular system was clearly to distinguish between the state and religion and the church, in fact, to protect the minorities, and mainly the yes. Jews and the Protestants at that time. And then the whole idea was, how do we go for more diversity and pluralism within the society? Now, the problem that we have is that even with this, the Muslims, as they have been repeating for the last 2 decades in France, we don't have a problem with this. This is okay with us. The problem is the perception of who are the Muslims, what is Islam, and you are connecting this, and I think it's quite critical here to understand that you can't talk about the secular system in France if you don't talk about this history between France and Algeria, for example, yes, exactly. The colonial period. So what kind of relationship are you making? Are you suggesting, for example, that the way France was dealing with the colonized people in North Africa could be the same as the way they are dealing with their own French Muslim citizens? Is it the same, or what are the similarities?
I think the conception that French civilization has a moral superiority and intellectual superiority to other civilizations, other outlooks, creates a binary system. And that binary system worked fairly well in the colonial era, when those who were others were in another place. They were effectively in North Africa. And in fact, if you were Algerian, when Algeria was France's extra department, you could become a French citizen if you denied Islam as your religion. So to become French when you were Algerian, you actually had to reject Islam. And I think that's a very telling indication of what France conceived being French to mean specifically, and it tells us it means to reject Islam as your identity. Now, I'm not saying that it's quite as extreme as that today. I don't think that the whole political class believes that everyone has to reject Islam in order to become a French citizen, but I do think that there's still a very complicated and difficult relationship to Islam and to the former colonized, and their place within society, their right to define the terms of the discourse, their right to contribute to the debate on laïcité. Why are we having generally who they are, white men in power, dictating to people who are usually impoverished in ghettoized communities what it means to be citizens? Do they not have a right to define it? And also, I think, I mean, again, this is going into the detail a bit, but, you know, if you look at the areas where you know, the Minister of Interior was targeting in order to eliminate the street prayers, for example, La Goutte d'Or in Paris is a very, very poor area. I mean, if you go to La Goutte d'Or, I'm pretty sure that citizens in La Goutte d'Or would have greater priorities than people praying in the street. I'm fairly sure insecurity, muggings, theft, you know, these are the sorts of fears, unemployment, these are the sorts of fears people in those areas have, and yet what are we talking about? We're talking about street prayers.
Yes, and this is one point which is important. The other side of the story is the fact that people were asking to get a mosque there, and they were facing administrative problems. Right. So at the same time, they are prevented from getting their mosques, and they pray outside, and then they are accused of colonizing the country, because this is the way Marine Le Pen was talking from the Front National, the far-right party, the populist party, saying, look at these Muslims, they are now colonizing the country. There are two things that are important here. The first is, even though you are saying, and this is quite right, there is still a very deep problem in the French psyche about this relationship between France and the old colonized people. Now they are becoming citizens, they are French, and we are reaching the second, third, and even the fourth generation of French Muslims now. They are citizens. And still there is something which is a reality, is this relationship, this complex relationship between the French state and religions is not only something which has to do with Muslims. It's religion seems to be a problem in France. And now the problem is we don't have a problem with churches, we don't have a problem with other symbols. It's Islam that has to be removed from the picture. So it means that beyond the colonial past, there is a specific understanding. And here we are not talking about laïcité as a legal system, but laïcité as an ideology. It's as if the perception of Islam per se, is at odds, in contradiction with the secular system. So why does it come from? Why do we have to deal with that now in France?
Well, I think, you know, from my perspective, this again goes back to the historical model, which was what was the ideological sourcing which the colonizers used, initially at least, in order to justify their opposition to the colonizers, and therefore what was viewed as the first and foremost barrier to French cultural penetration into North Africa. It was Islam. It was Islam that people called upon in order to wage their resistance wars. Abdelkader, you know, these people have a mythical status in communities where, of course, you know, the idea was that they were drawing on their cultural idiom, and that was Islam, in order to resist French cultural imperialism. Now, if you then bring that to the French context, what does Islam then have to contribute to a modern French identity, in which I don't think there really has been a recognition of whether colonialism was in any way a destructive pattern. I think we don't really acknowledge that. We've seen apologists in the French Parliament talking about, you know, we need to recognize the positive impact that colonization happened. We had movies like Les Indigènes, in which, you know, high-profile French Arab actors resisted the idea that, of course, you know, this French penetration, or the French Arabs had no part to play, for example, in liberating France, you know, challenging these misconceptions, and it was so poorly received by the dominant class. There was so much hostility to it. This is telling of the idea that, you know, generally speaking, the dominant classes in France aren't really willing to recognize a place on an equal stance for French Muslims and French Arabs.
Yes, and I think that this is important here, because very often when we speak about Islam in Europe, Islam in the West, we tend to fall into the trap of, oh, it's a religious question, we are dealing with, is Islam compatible with the secular system, which in fact is not the true question. Behind this there is a background, there is a legacy, a tradition, and we have to take into account all the cultural dimension, the political dimension, this power struggle. We are talking about domination, and we are talking about dominated people. Right. And it's exactly the same, for example, in the United States of America. You can't just get it if you just talk about Islam and the Muslim presence, if you don't understand blackness, whiteness, domination system, structural discrimination, and in France it's exactly the same. So having said that, now we have Muslim organizations, they are trying their best to show how much there is no problem for Muslims to be a French Muslim, to be even, you know, all this discussion between Islam in France or Islam of France, this big discussion, the President Nicolas Sarkozy saying, oh, Islam in France is over, we are talking about this, and coming back again with this discussion about integration. Having all what we said in mind, what should be the right answer? How can this change? Because the problem is true as well, that France has a problem with religion beyond Islam. And it's still a religious discussion. So how can we tackle this? How would you see the future here?
Well, I mean, I feel like some commissions that looked into the concept of laïcité did make some notable progress. For example, the Stasi Commission in 2003 suggested that Yom Kippur and Eid should be integrated into the national calendar as days off, in the same way that Easter or Christmas are.
But
these weren't adopted.
Yes, some were understanding this as this was positive things, just to be able, as the first proposal was to ban the headscarf. So they said that in order to make this
compensate,
possible.
Is it? Well, had it been to compensate, maybe it would have been a beginning of starting to say, well, actually, there's a formal recognition of Islam as a national religion in France, because symbolic or not as a measure, it would have instated it, it would have formalized the presence of Islam as a national religion, and we're not there yet. We're very, very far from that, to the point where the Minister of Interior is now talking about he wants to create a decree whereby people can't go to a hospital and ask for a female doctor, because this is considered against the values of the Republic. Now, of course, if Muslims don't have a part to play in defining the terms of the debate, then we don't really have very much to complain about. But I think Muslims are making an effort and are trying to make themselves heard, and this is the way forward is to be part of this discussion and what laïcité means as French citizens. I think there is this huge fear, and of course it was expressed by the Minister of Interior himself when he said the French don't feel like they're at home anymore. Let's help them make sure that they feel confident and at home. Nobody's talking about eliminating laïcité, nobody's talking about drastically altering it. Let's talk about exactly what it means, and let's talk about it in a unified discussion on an equal platform in which all sections of society have a right to participate in defining what it means.
That's very true. The problem is, how do you get that? Because at the end of the day, it's a theoretical discussion, but the perceptions are very bad. You said something which is quite important, is to be involved in the debate is also to give your own definitions of term. And not only, sometimes it's even to help the French to reconcile themselves with the very meaning of laïcité, which was not against religion, which was to try to have what was called a neutral space where all the religions can coexist. This is one dimension. Having said that, now we are dealing with politics, and we are dealing with dominant discourse, but also dominant forces. How can they be involved in politics and to change this? Because you know, having been there for 20 years trying to deal with this political arena, politicians, you feel that you are not heard, that it's at the end of the day there are social problems that are not solved. There are very deep perceptions of this, you know, Islam being alien to the French tradition that we cannot remove. You know, even Renan last 2 centuries ago was just saying this is not, you can't be a true French when you are still a Muslim, because Islam is against the mind, is against the intellect. What kind of contribution the Muslim can make now?
Well, it seems to me that there are some fairly solid alliances to be constructed in French society. I mean, it would not be fair to say that everyone is opposed to a greater Muslim presence, a recognition that Islam is part of the national cultural capital. I'm thinking, for example, of Christian associations who have also to some extent paid the price, although I think there have been many allowances made to Christianity in France on the basis of tradition. So Christian celebrations are permissible in like a public square using public money because this is part of national tradition. But it wouldn't be permissible.
Cultural than religious.
Right. So these are the arguments being used, but at the same time they are still being limited in their sphere of action, in their sphere of influence. And I think this is where building alliances where we defend the rights of other religious communities, for example, to be able to also express their religious identity, I think we'll find that, and we do find that other religious communities are struggling just as much as we are with this idea that there is a so-called neutral sphere. Let's talk about that more. Let's get together as religious associations and talk about what does it mean to claim there is such a thing as a neutral sphere for a person of religion? Because the neutral sphere, it seems, is a reflection of the dominant ideology. The idea that the Republican model is a neutral model in which everyone can just melt away is actually running up against certain difficulties in practice. Let's bring those difficulties to light, but not in an exclusivist fashion.
But even the question of, you know, this perception that there is a neutral sphere, as Tariq Ramadan is saying, or Charles Taylor is saying as well, that this is a theoretical framework that it never happened in France. In fact, you can feel that it's still a mainstream Catholic tradition. It's a secular system, but still the cultural Catholic tradition is there. It's shaping something. The point here is that in this discussion, when the Muslims are part of the process, and what you are saying, it's important. By the way, you are saying something which is to deal with Christians, and that's very true, that we have lots of Christians that are opening up, and they are with us in this understanding that the secular system is not against religion. We also have lots of people who are secular and even atheists in France. And the teaching league, for example, La Ligue Française de l'Enseignement, these are people who are not religious people, sometimes atheists, and they are still saying all what we are doing in the name of laicity is wrong. This is an ideological translation of the laical or the laicity or the secular system, and we need to try to find something else. Having said that, there is one point which is important. At the end of the day, we can be open to the people, open to the civil society. It's a relationship of power. It's a power struggle. How are we going to deal with this? How would you suggest, for example, or would you push the people as someone who knows the society to be much more involved in politics? Because at the end, you change opinions and you change perceptions by being within the civil society, but also dealing with power, because this is where things can move and change.
I think we have to deal with power. There's no question. I mean, getting involved in the political system is a necessary path towards affecting real institutional change. And of course, it's one of two ways of developing, and I think the other has to be working in civil society to change people's personal opinions. But I think, you know, as you said, there are people like the Socialist members of the Socialist Party and also communist parties who've said, you know, they've said overtly that they have no objection, for example, to even street prayers. I mean, that was quite a difficult stance for example, the mayor of one of the districts, the 8th district of Paris, to take during this whole dilemma, because this is not an issue on which most people would be prepared to step out of line. But he stood out and said, you know, I don't really object to people praying in the street. I mean, if they don't have places to pray. Exactly. So we have allies in that. But I mean, I'm personally leaning a lot towards, and I think the French scene has done this a lot, artistic ways of challenging the status quo. We have artists, musical artists, we have actors, comedians that are really challenging the status quo using really interesting methods, and this, I think, is affecting changes in ways
more than politics.
Absolutely, and that's where I hope people will continue to work.
Thank you. I think that we have been able to discuss about many issues here and to understand a bit the specificities of the French system. It's not only a question of the secular or the French secular system. It has to do with a background, legacy, a tradition, a historical experience connecting France with the colonial experience and colonialism in Algeria, for example, and now having people being Arabs and Muslims and being French at the same time and asking for their rights, and this visibility is problematic. It's problematic for all the religions, but it's more problematic for Muslims. And at the end of the day, this question is really how the French Muslims can be involved in the discussion, define the terms of the debates, and at the same time to be much more involved in many ways, not only in politics, not only in religious settings, but also on culture, arts, and any way of expressing who they are and what they want. Well, that's all we have time for. Please let us know your thoughts and views on any of the shows you have seen, and here is the way to contact us.
We'd like to hear your views on today's show, as well as ideas for future programmes. You can do this by emailing us at islamanlife@presstv.co.uk. You can also join our Facebook page by searching Islam and Life on Press TV, where you can view past programmes, keep up to date on future shows, leave comments and meet other Islam and Life fans.
Finally, I would like to thank my guest, Myriam Francois Serra. Thank you so much for your insight and presence, and I hope to see you next week, inshallah.